Hello everyone, so this is the final video I'm doing for you on short story analysis. And of course the hope is that you like one of these stories. The idea of the assignment I'm giving you is that you find a story that you like and use it in a way to make connections with another story that you've read, maybe a novel or film, just something else. It could be a piece of art, it could be a piece of music, but in a way that makes you see it afresh or anew. The idea here is of that sort of Hegelian idea of a thesis meeting an antithesis, creating a synthesis. This is what I like about comparative studies, and that's essentially what I'm asking you to do, is make comparisons, contrasts between one of these short stories and the other thing you've chosen. And then you can tell me about how you're seeing it differently because of the story that you've read. That's the kind of thing we're looking for here. So here we are with a story called The Spiral. And perhaps thankfully we leave behind the blood and the gore and enter a completely different world. For context, I should tell you that this story is the last story in a collection called the Cosmi Comics that Italo Calvino wrote in 1968, or at least it was published in 1968. Why don't I tell you about the first story? Because that will perhaps help you to understand what's going on in The Spiral. So, the first story is called At Daybreak, and we encounter Kwifka for the first time, together with all his family and friends, his tribe, if you like. And they are, if you like, formless entities, formless sentiences inhabiting the intergalactic dust, which is on the point of becoming the nebula from which will form the solar system. So that's the context. And they're just kind of, floating around. And so why don't I give you a quote, actually. This is actually from the first story. So there was nothing to do but wait, keep covered up as best we could, doze, speak out now and then to make sure we were all still there, and naturally scratch ourselves, because they can say what they like, but with all these particles spinning around into each other, the effect was a troublesome itching. So there they are. They itch, and the more they itch, the more there is friction, the more they start moving around and bouncing into each other and colliding, and things start to clot and heat up, and suddenly there's light, and so, well, you get the picture. We have the beginning of the universe, as it were. In this process, Kwifka's granny loses her cushion. She has a little ellipsoid of galactic matter that she sits on, and so that goes spinning away. And Kwifka's sister is so totally freaked out by this whole thing that she just jumps into the first solid thing she can find, which ends up being planet Earth. And as Kwifka says, he doesn't see her again until 1912 in Canberra, Australia, married to a certain Sullivan, who was a retired railroad man. So changed I hardly recognized her, says Kwifka. So you get the comedy of this too, right? There's another story called Games Without End. And in this story, Kwifka is playing with his brother Pufpa. And they find hydrogen atoms in line with steady state hypothesis. And they just roll them around. And so let me give you another quote here from that story. Since space was curved, we sent the atoms rolling along its curve like so many marbles. And the kid whose atom went furthest won the game. And so we have this sort of lovely image of the universe being created by a couple of meddling kids playing marbles, right? And then we end up with this story. So, you know, in the course of evolution, Kvifka finds himself in the form of a mollusk. And so here he is in the spiral. I suppose, turning to this story now, we should ask ourselves the question we should always ask at the beginning. We did this with rhetorical analysis, and we do it with story analysis too. What's the message? Or what's the theme, however you want to put it? Or what are the themes? And having read the story, and of course I assume you have, otherwise what's the bloody point of watching this video? I suppose we might agree that we have lots of different themes here. It could be creation. It could be more scientifically Big Bang theory. It could be love. It could be time. And in some respects here, we have ontological questions. Ontology is that branch of philosophy that deals with being in the world. What is being? And perhaps this story is ontological in that sense. It seems to be asking the question, you know, what am I? Who am I? Where am I? What's the point? Questions like that. And the story begins wonderfully, I think, with a mystery, with a question. Why don't we just look at this? Let me just bring it up on the screen. Yeah, this initial paragraph here at the bottom of 117. For the majority of mollusks, the visible organic form has little importance in the life of the members of a species, since they cannot see one another and have at most only a vague perception of other individuals and of their surroundings. This does not prevent brightly colored stripings and forms, which seem very beautiful to our eyes, from existing independently of any relationship to visibility. Have a think about that for a moment. You're walking along the beach, as you all have done, and you see a beautiful shell, and you pick it up and you look at it. Maybe it's a mollusk shell. So the question is, why? Why is it so beautiful? If the thing inside it, the thing that created it, can't see, that's the mystery. That's the question that kicks off this whole story. And as we progress through it, I mean, all sorts of things to say, of course, but the first is this, right in front of you. What do you notice? We have an italicized section followed by normal text, shall we say. And then a bit later on, we go back into italics. I'll say a bit more about that later in this video, but firstly, we notice it. And secondly, obviously what we've got here is a change in narrative planes. There seems to be a kind of omniscient creator, authorial type voice here in the italics, and then we shift into first person, which is Kvifka talking about himself. Okay, so we should note that, and there is something significant to say about it a bit later. Okay, now, if we go into the story itself, we find some sort of description about what Kvifka is, and I'm going to take you now to 118 here on the left. At the top, he says, form, I didn't have any. That is, I didn't know I had one, or rather, I didn't know you could have one. I grew more or less on all sides at random, if this is what you call radial symmetry. I suppose I had radial symmetry, but to tell you the truth, I never paid any attention to it. Why should I have grown more on one side than on the other? I had no eyes, no head, no part of the body that was different from any other part. And now I try to persuade myself that the two holes I had were a mouth and an anus, and that I therefore already had my bilateral symmetry. and so on. I had no brain to think of these thoughts, every cell in its own thought, every thinkable thing all at once, not through images, since we had no images of any kind at our disposal, but simply in that indeterminate way of feeling oneself there, which did not prevent us from feeling ourselves equally there in some other way. So here he is. He's kind of happy, pappy, little sort of mollusky type thing in the water. It was a rich and free and contented condition. Quite the contrary of what you might think. I was a bachelor. Right, now, at the bottom here of 118, we start to find out some more about Krivka. So I wasn't so backward that I didn't know something else existed beyond me. And so what we have here is the emerging sensation or awareness of other and otherness. So he's clinging to the rock, and the water was a source of information, reliable and precise. So the system worked like this. A wave would come, and I, still sticking to the rock, would raise myself up a little bit imperceptibly and splat the water past beneath me, full of substances and sensations and stimuli. So next paragraph in 119, here it is. And so I learned that there were the others. And the element surrounding me was filled with traces of them, hostile and indifferent or whatever. But as we now discover, there is a significant other, and it is a female. And you can see the brum 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 in the water that excites him about her. 2/3 of the way down 119, so then one of them, shloop, 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 emitted her eggs, and I, shloop, 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 fertilized them, all down inside the sea, mingling in the water, tepid from the sun. Oh, I forgot to tell you, I could feel the sun, which warmed the sea and heated the rock. So, there is a significant other, and of course, that being the case, and having fallen in love, which he tells us here, at the bottom of 119, everything else follows from that, including all the agitation and the jealousy and the resentments and the problems. 120, I knew her well, in other words, and I wasn't sure of her. Every now and then I was overcome with suspicion, anxiety, and rage. So in this procreative sort of instinct that he has, in this passion that he has, he conceives the idea that he should make himself significant to her. He should make himself identifiable and unique. And so it is that he begins to secrete what we understand is a spiral. And he describes this process here towards the bottom of 120. I began to secrete calcareous matter. I wanted to make something to mark my presence in an unmistakable fashion. Something that would defend this individual presence of mine from the indiscriminate instability of all the rest. Next page, he tells us that at regular intervals, the calcareous matter I was secreting came out coloured, so as a number of lovely stripes were formed, running straight through the spirals. So there it is. He makes his shell for her. And I think this is the point at which we should pause and consider the significance of the spiral shape, the figure of the spiral, not least because this, after all, is the title of the story. In the classroom, I ask my students to come up with different spirals that they can think of, that we find in nature, in the world around us. It usually starts quite slowly, and then somebody says something, and then we have lots of different ideas of what spirals there might be out there. But so as to structure this, I thought it might be a good idea to begin at least with a reference to Fibonacci, who was a 13th century mathematician who was intrigued by the world around him, and particularly rabbits and bees, the way they populate and grow And inspired by Euclid in part, he observed, and from this observation came up with what we call the Fibonacci number sequence. Many of you, of course, will be familiar with this. This is a sequence whereby each number is established by adding the previous two. So 0 plus 1 equals 1, 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8, and so on and so forth. Right? These are the Fibonacci sequences. And interestingly, when you actually put them down in block form, you can create a spiral. I think it's going to help if I actually show you that, isn't it? So here we are. So yeah, you can see how these numbers next to each other form blocks, and then oops, I'll come to that in a moment. This is how we can create a spiral out of these Fibonacci blocks. So what we have here is that the squares have sides equal to Fibonacci numbers. So each expansion of the spiral is a precise distance away on the radius, which is to say it's 6.854 times further out from the previous turn. And that's known as the principle of phi, which is also called the Fibonacci ratio or the golden mean, used by architects, for example. And you arrive at that by dividing each number in the sequence by the previous, okay? And you go on doing that until you get to this quotient, which is 1.6181, the number phi. So this is not just found in nature, but also in man-made objects, because the ancient Greeks realized that these Fibonacci principles can be used to create things that are pleasing to the eye. So, for example, a lot of Greek architecture is organized on Fibonacci principles. The Parthenon is a good example. And in the story, we have a reference to the pyramids in Giza. So in that case, the walls are of roughly Fibonacci proportions and a height relative to the square root of phi. Okay, I'm just reading that in front of me. We can see this same spiral, if you like, projected as a Fibonacci construct here in man-made and natural objects. And when we have a spiral which suggests a continuation, a continuous sequence or iteration, we have what's called a logarithmic spiral. And an example of that would be the galaxy, for example, right? So let's just show you another image there, which might help us. Yeah. So you can see how we can use that sort of block spiral creation to sort of see the spirals that are in front of us here. And I just saw this the other day, which immediately made me think of this, which I think is quite impressive. And this is the new staircase in the Vatican Library, which is a wonderful spiral, I think. And you can just see how intriguing and attractive and sort of mesmerizing it is. We might also think of DNA, the sort of double helix spiral intrinsic to DNA, which is integral to our very substance and being. I told you this was an ontological story, right? And it's just surprising how often you encounter it. One of the things I do in my summers, which is to say when I'm not teaching, is I play, well, I play the violin badly, I play golf very badly, and I generally lose money trading currencies. I mention that because, oops, I keep missing it, because of the Fibonacci indicator that you will find on most trading platforms. So let's just look at what we got in front of us here, because I just think this is fascinating. We have here the weekly price chart of the US dollar and the Singapore dollar, I think SGD. And you can see that we have what seems to be a bottom price back in June 2014, and what seems to be kind of a top. Here we are in November 2016. So what the trader has done here is they've drawn this dotted line here from bottom to top of price, creating now a Fibonacci level. Here's 0 at the top and 100 at the bottom. And all of these thick red bars represent the Fibonacci sequence or numbers that you're going to meet between 0 and 100. And then on a sort of micro level, you can see the trader has identified a sort of internal bottom price here, going back up to the same top. And so that creates another Fibonacci series of levels here in green, as you can see on the screen there. Now, why would you do that? It's because so often price turns on a Fibonacci level. And so it can help you to identify a good entry point for buying or selling, and it can help you identify a good exit point when to take profits, or if you're making a loss, to get out of the deal. So here, imagine that this is current day here. I think the trader would be bold, to say the least, to be selling. It might drop a bit more down to that 100 level here, but there's a suggestion that it's turning around at that 50% Fibonacci level in red and that 100% Fibonacci level in green, and therefore there's a higher probability of it going back up than there is of it going further back down. Now, of course, if I made that trade, it would go against me. You know, this is risky, and for God's sake, don't be spending your hard-earned money trading currencies. But, you know, isn't this fascinating that you should actually find a Fibonacci spiral indicator, if you like, on a trading system? And pretty much any trader on the planet is going to have this. And that raises the interesting question of whether price follows Fibonacci levels in some mysterious Kafka type way, or whether it's just perception based, that because we all think it does, therefore it does. It follows perception. It's probably that, isn't it? But anyway, I thought I would just mention that to you. So it's kind of interesting. Evolution, if you think about it, is also spiral in nature. If we imagine how evolution takes an event and then further and further iterations of that construction or that selection or whatever it is, this is how we evolve, and this is very much suggested in the story. So to begin with, Kafka describes himself as having no symmetry, and then radial symmetry, and then bilateral symmetry. And so we can see his evolution in that sense. And he does the same with eyesight. So to begin with, you know, it's just the opening of eyes in primitive organisms in the pond or the ocean. And then we move to cuttlefish and to lobsters and crustaceans, and fish and eels, and then humans. And you can see how we're constantly moving out, as if in a kind of a logarithmic spiral outwards, until you get a human looking through a telescope at a human looking at, and we have this kind of a dynamic in the text here. At some point in the evolutionary process, of course, we have human beings who don't just have eyes, but mouths, and so we have language, and language which then becomes written and seen, and then text which is replicated and printed and reproduced and translated and revised and amended, and reproduced. And so, this is all suggested in this italicized section that we have in the middle of the story. Look what it says here, the bottom of 121. And I mean, actually, the first thing while I come to it is it's almost as though that italicized section here between two other sections is like a stripe, isn't it? It's like that sort of a visual stripe in the text between that and that. So I think that's one of the functions of the italics here. So now, after 500 million years have gone by, I look around, and above the rock I see the railway embankment and the train passing along it with a party of Dutch girls looking out of the window. And in the last compartment, a solitary traveller reading Herodotus in a bilingual edition. Now, you may have thought, why? Why does he say that? Well, Herodotus is our first sort of text, history text. And it's exactly what I've just been saying. It's been reproduced so many times, and now it's been translated into so many different languages, so that over time that text grows into so many other texts and interpretations of text. And there's a sign with the pyramids and the words "Visit Egypt," and an ice cream wagon tries to pass the big truck. We have an encyclopedia, and we have bees. Right? So hopefully now you can understand why he's just dropping all of these different spiral forms into this story. There's a reference to Cleopatra. How many different iterations of Cleopatra have there been? This is what he talks about at the end. I see all this and I feel no amazement, because making the shell implied also all the other spirals around us. Making the honey in the wax comb, and the coal, and the telescopes, and the reign of Cleopatra, and the films about Cleopatra, and the pyramids. So, Krivka manifests himself as a beautiful shell. Why? Go back to the first part of the story. It's so as to make himself significant to the mollusk he's fallen in love with, to identify himself to her. This plan of his presupposes that she will be able to see him. And what we discover in part 3 is that his wonderful little project all starts to go wrong. Look at the bottom here of 122. The shell was able to create visual images of shells, which are things very similar, as far as we know, to the shell itself, except that the shell is here, whereas the images of it are formed elsewhere, possibly on a retina. An image, therefore, presupposes a retina, which in turn presupposes a complex system stemming from an encephalon, a brain. So, and in many ways, this is the crucial turn in the story. In producing the shell, I also produced its image, Not one, of course, but many, because with one shell you can make as many shell images as you want, which is what I've just been saying about text and all this other stuff. But only potential images, because to form an image, you need all the requisites I mentioned before. An encephalon with its optic ganglia and an optic nerve to carry the vibrations from outside to inside. And this optic nerve at the other extremity ends in something made purposely to see what there is outside, namely the eye. Now, for myself, I had none of this equipment, so I was the least authorized to speak of it. However, I conceived an idea of my own, namely that the thing was to form some visual images, and the eyes would come later in consequence. So I concentrated on making the part of me that was outside give rise to an image, or rather to what later might be called a lovely image. And in doing this, he figured that she would be doing the same thing, and that they would eventually see each other by forming some kind of encephalon equipment and an optic nerve and an eye. And halfway down 123, he says, you know, I wasn't mistaken. Even today, I'm sure that the project was right. But my error lay in thinking that sight would also come to us. That is, to me and to her. I elaborated a harmonious colored image of myself to enter her visual receptivity, to occupy its center, to settle there, so that she could utilize me constantly in dreaming and in memory, with thought as well as with sight. And I felt at the same time she was radiating an image of herself so perfect that it would impose itself on my foggy backward senses, developing in me an interior visual field where it would blaze forth definitely. Well, it doesn't happen. So our efforts led us to become those perfect objects of a sense whose nature nobody quite knew yet, and which later became perfect precisely through the perfection of its object, which was in fact us. I'm talking about sight, the eyes. Only I had failed to foresee one thing. The eyes that finally opened to us didn't belong to us, but to others. And what follows is this despairing list of all these other shits in Kvifka's world who have sight because of him, and he's the one who remains blind. Shapeless, colorless beings, sacks of guts. Yeah? Didn't belong to us, but to others. And they came and went and whatever, you know, these intruders who'd never before given thought to the possibility of eyesight. They were ugly, idiots, benefiting because of me. And then here on 124, this despairing sort of statement he makes. To sum it up in a few words, they developed eyes at our expense. I think what we arrive at here, for all Kvifka's evident frustration and despair, is arguably some profound insights for us. The first is to do with creation. Calvino seems to be detaching the notion of creation from any sort of traditional notion of a god in a sort of religious sense here. In a sense, the world is created now by us. The world is created by the choices that we make, the actions that we take. This story is reminding us that we make our lives significant with every decision that we make. To put it another way, there is a world, and when you make an action, it is now the world plus your action. And in that sense, you've remade the world. In every action that you take, in every decision that you make, it's almost an expression of existentialism. It's almost pure Jean-Paul Sartre. existentialism in that sense, that we make meaning through the choices and decisions that we take as individuals. I think if I just take you back to 122, this is what Calvino is saying here in Koifka. Just here in the beginning of section 3. Since the shell had a form, the form of the world was also changed. In the sense that it now included the form of the world as it had been without a shell, plus the form of the shell. And I think that's this notion of creation that Calvino is exploring here and asking us to consider. The second is, in a sense, to make us realize how complicit we are in Koifka's project, in this act of creation. Every time we see something that we find beautiful, we are, in a sense, seeing a reflection of Koifka's project, the result, if you like, of Koifka's project, taken so many millions of years ago. We are the beneficiaries of that project. And I think what Calvino is asking us to do is this: you walk along a beach, as you all do, you pick up a beautiful mollusk shell, keep it in your hand until you find another one. And then you pick up the other one, and then you look at them both next to each other. And I think the suggestion here is this is how Koifka can meet his love, and she meet him. It's in their reflections to be found on our retina as we look at them. In that sense, their love is mediated in our gaze as we gaze upon them. I think this is a fabulous concept, a fabulous idea. It almost makes us part of a communion of love in Koifka's project, failed as it seems to be to him. And that takes us to the very ending of this story, which I think is blindingly brilliant. Here he says, and at the bottom of each of those eyes, your eyes, my eyes, when we're on that beach looking, I lived, or rather another me lived, one of the images of me, and it encountered the image of her, the most faithful image of her, in that beyond, which opens past the semi-liquid sphere of the irises, in the darkness of the pupils, the mirrored hall of the retinas, in our true element, which extends without shores, without boundaries. There we are. What a lovely story, or at least I think it is. I'm going to leave that with you, and hopefully the story works for you. If not, hopefully one of the others. And I will see you again soon. Bye for now.